It's sunny in England.
Is it?
Yeah. You wouldn't know it, but there's a tiny window.
You wouldn't know it.
Not from my screen. What's it like where you guys are?
It's sunny and windy.
Is it?
Mm-hmm.
It's sunny. I haven't been out, so I don't know what it is.
The weather here's actually been super weird in the Pacific Northwest. Like yesterday, we had snow and hail, and then I drove a little bit, and there was a bright, sunny sky, and then you could look out and see the clouds forming and watch the landscape was just being obliterated by this torrential storm that made everything blurred out. You couldn't see the mountains, and it's very weird weather. Yeah, weather drama. Well, good morning, everybody. Welcome to Solid Ground live stream, April 3rd. No, 3rd? Is that right?
Mm-hmm.
April 3rd, 2023. And today we are joined by Deborah Knox. So happy to have you, Deborah.
Thank you.
Deborah is a part of our Solid Ground community, and Jody's missing. She's going to miss a couple of these live streams going forward for a little bit. And we thought it would be really fun to have Deborah join us to join in the chat. And so happy you're here.
Well, I'm very excited.
Well, David, would you like to start us off with the intro to Solid Ground?
Yep, let's get the blurb on. So Solid Ground is a peer support community for anyone concerned about the imposition of critical social justice, CSJ, aka woke, and or COVID mandates in their workplace, university, children's school, or community. We offer weekly online peer support groups in which members share ideas, thoughts, and support for how to navigate the impact of these ideologies and answer the question, where do we go from here? You can join one of our groups for only $5 per month. To find out how to join our community, please visit solidgroundsupport.com. And please note, Solid Ground does not provide psychotherapy or legal advice, and nothing we do should be construed as such. Thanks very much.
Thank you. How have your groups been lately?
Good. I've really enjoyed the last sort of, I guess, month or so of groups. I always enjoy them, but I think there's a sense in which people are, I don't know, getting a bit sort of more restless with maybe just talking about the problems of woke, maybe more thinking. There seems to be a stirring of, well, let's think about what we do want to talk about. What is it that we really do want to focus our time on now? Because instead of being anti something, we want to be pro something eventually. And I think there's just a sort of feeling, I think I'm not just getting it in the groups either. It's actually happening on my course a bit too. I think there's a sense in which people find some of this stuff, not nourishing. So it's a case of, right, well, if we're not going to do this, what are we going to talk about a bit more? That's what I'm noticing anyway. So it's led to some kind of fun conversations, some quite sort of deep thoughts about where to go, what would be a useful thing to ponder. And yeah, I don't know, I've just found it quite interesting.
It's like a woke fatigue or anti-woke fatigue.
Yeah.
Definitely. Like we can only talk about this stuff so much.
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm. How about you, Jennifer?
Oh, the groups are great. It's really, really interesting. We, people are connecting really well. It's so nice because people come to the group that have never been before, but they hit it off with other group members instantly. And we have really interesting conversations. And I feel like I'm learning a lot from being in the groups. It's great.
That's awesome. And Deborah, you've been doing it for a long time, haven't you?
And I've been going to a lot of them. I won't say all of them, but I'm still seeing the same thing that David's sort of talking about, where either we're kind of even going back further, like what is motivating greater things in the society, like, oh, technology, or, it's like we're not just focused on this, there's like bigger dynamics and what do we think about those things. And then, I do see people's more creative stirrings, or further talking about beauty after that topic had come up. And so I like it. It feels enriching. It feels like we are leaning into something more forward moving, and it feels more hopeful, I'd say.
Oh, I really like that. I just realized I gave you a very very inadequate introduction. Would you mind giving a little bit of an intro for yourself and talk a little bit about?
I keep it
Yeah.
probably brief. I mean, I
Yeah.
came to all of this as someone who had been a lifetime liberal, progressive, very, very steeped in that. Who probably in the previous number of years had started to, for various reasons, looking into other perspectives other than my own. I kind of received all my values and views in a rather sort of knee-jerk fashion, if you will. And so even prior to sort of that 2016 political moment, I'd already been starting to think about, other people's points of view. And then after Trump came in, after my initial, I can't get out of bed for a couple of days, whatever sort of thing, I must admit I had that. I started seeing all the polarization going on, and that was of concern to me. And so I got involved with Braver Angels, which tries to understand perspectives, red and blue. I was a moderator there. And so I was slowly opening up my worldview. And then it was, I think that, 2020 combination of the killing of George Floyd and COVID, all of those different things that made me suddenly go, wait a minute, I'm not sure. I really don't know if I'm unsure I'm on board with what I always was going with, or the way my side is seeming to go with things. And being isolated during the pandemic, I just went down many, many different rabbit holes, started listening, especially say to Black conservatives, like getting like, oh, there's a whole other perspective here. And that opened up to all of these different topics of wokeness. I don't have children in the school system. I have my own business, so things aren't happening in that domain, but I had a lot of time on my hands. So then I just started seeing where all these different things were spreading. I had quite a degree of alarm, and also wasn't sure about speaking about it. I wasn't sure how to do it in a way that I might speak to my side or something like that. So I've just been slowly inching my way there, mostly pushing viewpoint diversity as a value and not treading into any particular topics too closely.
Mm-hmm. So it sounds like it was the clamping down of discourse that really caused you to shift your perspective, like feeling that things polarized so much was.
Yeah, well, even back then, I don't think there was so much clamping number of years ago. It was just more like I couldn't bear to see lots of division. And I also have I guess I developed my own sort of personal practice around realizing I don't know everything, and I purposefully put myself in front of views that I don't know or understand or even thought I disdained or something. And I have like a sort of, it's like a mission, like there must be some reason I want to get why this person holds this. What was their life experience? Like I'm missing something if I don't get this about this person. I might not go all on board or something, but like a piece of information in the universe is here. And so I ought to know what it is. And see, it's a lot of it is an integration kind of thing for me, actually, just personally. And so I hold myself to that. There's times when I'm just like, ugh, about something, but then I know I need to do a little work there. So, and that doesn't mean taking on board really things that probably everyone would agree are awful. So there's some discernment there still.
Discernment, but still seeking understanding.
Yeah. Like I have this sort of view about like sort of partial truths. There could be a kernel. There's like some, somewhere in there. So what is that? If there's something I'm coming up against. And I think all of that also, somehow this kind of cultivation of goodwill towards others, like just even if I'm not liking what someone's saying, like I'm really wanting to work on like not having my heart closed or being relationally shut off. And that's, it's easy to say because I've certainly gotten my own places where I'm feeling some resentment or, oh, I'm not liking what those people are saying, or something like that. Or I feel hurt, or not hurt, but I feel afraid of what might happen if I say what I'm going to think or something like that. But I kind of feel, especially looking at Braver Angels works, I feel like our pathway is like seeing the humanity. It sounds so mundane, but seeing the humanity in other people and actually moving from there primarily. And I'm not perfect at it by any means. I mean, it's kind of ongoing, but that sort of seems like one of our ways out of all the division.
Yeah, rehumanizing instead of dehumanizing. So in our chat that we were having prior to this live stream, you brought up the idea of activism and what role that plays in what we're seeing today, these movements and our culture in general. And when you first said the word activist, or what I immediately thought of was how when I was in graduate school, I was shocked that as counselors, we were being told that our primary role would be that of an activist. That seemed really, that just seemed really antithetical to what I thought I would be doing. I thought I would be working with an individual, with one-on-one with individuals, or maybe with couples or families, but not seeing myself in terms of the outward social structures as much. And I guess maybe antithetical isn't really the right word. There are aspects of this that's antithetical, but it's at least diagonal from. It's not where I thought I would be going. And there has been so much pressure from the social justice movement on people, adherents, to be activists, to work on changing institutions, et cetera. And so that's where my mind went when we talked about activism. Where did that come up for you, and how are you framing that in your mind?
Well, I was thinking of just some of the more hot sort of issues of the day, culture war issues, and we get into detail, or not even just culture war. You might have the climate activists like your Extinction Rebellion. You might have some of the more radical trans activists, and so there's some ways that like that's just very in the news, or at least in the media I look at, and I look at that, and then I also look at causes in the past, like women getting suffrage, or things like that, where there were people who bothered to take some sort of action. They didn't just sort of wait till someone said, we're going to just give this thing to you because we suddenly figured it out. Or even same-sex marriage or something like that. There were people who were working the ground, working the crowd, whatever we want to call it. And it made me just wonder, like, one, do we need that? If we do, are there better ways to do it, not better ways to do it? You've seen the shadow side of it, right? Especially when there's like a pressure that everyone should do it. And in your profession, it's like one would assume to be neutral is probably a good value. And here you're being asked to purport or push a particular, the right one or something. So that's where it kind of came up for me. I think a lot of it is just seeing some things happening in the world where there's a lot of action. We could say the other way, you could see farmers in the Netherlands, or all the people protesting in Europe. I mean, we might call that, I don't know if protesting is necessarily activism, but so I just wonder about it as a phenomenon. Was there healthy versions, non-healthy versions? What do we, I don't know.
I'm really interested in that distinction that you just raised, protesting versus activism, because I wonder how this kind of, like this sort of channel, like the discussions that we have, where we're raising concerns about trends that we're seeing socially and in a particular profession. Is that protesting? Is that activism? How does that fit in? Because it is striving for something. But when I think of activism, I sort of think of necessarily a progressivism, because it's seeking a change. And I don't know, I don't really have what are other people's thoughts on this?
It's interesting, isn't it? Because then you think about change, and you think about the move away from values, previously held values, the move towards something else. That seems to be sort of embedded within the assumptions on what activism is. But you can surely have activism that doesn't necessarily have to take that into account. I was thinking when we brought up the topic that modern day activism for me feels more like kind of pitchfork, puritanical, chase people out of a village type mob activity than it does actual. I remember growing up, not growing up, but like when I was in my early 20s, being in London, and some of the protests against student debt, or like student fees and things like that. These felt like things that were quite close to me and my demographic at the time, I guess. So there was a sense in which that we were protesting for something, but it felt like a very different mood, a very different. There were still moments where things got overspilled, but it felt like it just felt very different to what we consider now in terms of activism. It didn't feel like the sort of pitchfork, burn things down sort of activism we see today. But then today we also see activism as being how many likes you get on Twitter, right? Or you see in people's bios that they're an activist, and you think, Is that activism as well? It's an interesting one, isn't it? Because I think there's quite a few different definitions for it, I think, in different contexts in which it's used, and different ways in which people celebrate each other's activism. Yeah.
When you just have activist in your bio, that seems a little mercenary, you know, like, what is it you're striving for? Are you just striving to strive? I guess. What do you think, Jennifer?
This is funny. Well, I immediately, if I see activist, I think pain in the ass. Not that it's always bad to be a pain in the ass. Sometimes it's necessary, but I think I have a bit of a negative take on it, because I do see it, at least now, as essentially sort of a movement of authoritarianism. You will think this way. If you don't, we'll see if we can get you fired from your job, kind of, you know, cancel culture business. So, and when David was talking, I sort of started thinking, well, is there conservative activism? And is that, should that be called something different? Because I think that's sort of where I find myself falling. Not that I necessarily see myself as a conservative. I think I don't know what I am anymore, but I think I'm a classic liberal with some sort of conservative instincts, in that I don't like to kind of blow things up and make drastic changes without a thorough investigation of potential costs. And I do find myself wanting to preserve a lot of things in our culture that I think have worked well for a very, very long time, and not tear those things down. But I don't know. I don't think of myself as an activist. Maybe I am and I don't know it. I'm sure there's a lot of people who see me as a pain in the ass. So my former workplace definitely sees me as a pain in the ass. So I don't know, but I don't like the word activist.
It is interesting on the conservative thing. I'm just sorry to jump in. I'm just thinking, I think Chris Rufo is calling himself now an activist. So, you know, he's doing his fight against, you know, CRT and DEI and such, and he's choosing that word probably intentionally. So it seems like there's at least one.
That's
Well,
really
maybe,
interesting.
Maybe
Sorry,
that
Jennifer.
will more positive associations with that word. If people like Christopher Rufo are using it, then maybe I might have a better feeling about it.
Maybe we should all use it after this. We should all put it in our bios after today, right? I guess on that level, then, could activism be, raising awareness about a social issue, raising awareness so that you can raise up the voice, certain voices, or, you know, it could still be exactly sort of some of the activism you hear when you hear sort of people saying, oh, we need to decenter this, or we need to raise the voices here. We're doing all that anyway, aren't we? We're just not taking we're doing it from our point of view. We're not necessarily, but it is flavored, isn't it, with left-wing authoritarianism at the moment.
Well, the new Oxford Dictionary, New Oxford American Dictionary defines activist as a person who campaigns to bring about political or social change. And so it seems like, according to that definition and according to the connotation that we all have, it is necessarily sort of a progressive thing. Let's change the norms, let's change the customs. And so by that definition, could there be such thing as a conservative activist? If a conservative is somebody who wants to preserve a standing cultural institution, norm, whatever, custom, I wonder what that would then be called.
Like, I don't know, how about the pro-life people? Like, I don't know what they call themselves. If, say, they're out campaigning, whatever, speaking, like, I don't know what they refer to themselves as.
That's a good question.
Well, I was going to say, it's a bit frustrating to think that anyone can sort of stake their claim on what's progressive in some ways. Do you know what I mean? Like, because what would that be? I guess a conservative one would be, you wouldn't necessarily have to go on a protest and march for something unless it was being challenged elsewhere if you were conservative. So I guess but you wouldn't want to call that anti-activism, would you, or something like that? You want to be like, no, I'm pro something. So yeah. Anyway, we're getting into kind of language games now, aren't we?
Well, it's really interesting because I mean, when we think of liberal or conservative, we think about like Democrat and Republican, but really liberal and conservative are, and I don't know, David, if that's what you think of, because you have different party system there slightly. But each issue, if you think about conservative versus progressive, could be evaluated on its own. So it would just be progressive against the tide of current day custom, right? So if pro-life is the example, then if the custom is that a certain thing is allowable in a culture, say abortion is allowable in a culture, and you're wanting to change that, are you not the progressive one at that point? And am I getting deeply in the weeds here?
No. What's coming up for me, and I know I'm being a bit sort of difficult here, but I'm just thinking all of the progressive activists, some of the most annoying ones are the ones that believe themselves to be pushing against a completely mischaracterized idea of what society is. So society is racist and therefore I am the freedom fighter. And it's like, you have completely misdiagnosed what's going on. Well, not completely, but your whole thing is based on the premise that's not well thought through, that's a low resolution way of thinking about it. And you've pretty much put on your activism armor, started a fire on the end of your pole, and you've marched out. And we're the guys going, guys, before you run over everything and destroy a few things and start a few fires in your local community, maybe you should consider whether or not you are actually being as progressive as you think you are, or you even know what you're talking about.
I think that's a really good point, because they are, a lot of the time, it seems like they're chasing paper tigers. I mean, these things are oversimplified and then draped in front of them like a red cape in front of a bull.
I don't know if it's too soon to do this, but I know of two examples of activism that I feel is done in perhaps a more healthier or maybe successful manner. And I mean, I would argue the general approach, say for same-sex marriage, I think of, if you listen to Andrew Sullivan and then Jonathan Rauch, who really worked in that, and they did it in a way that was very much like sort of open, friendly. They wanted to dialogue with churches. They wanted to go talk to people who had objections to it, and they wanted to do it in a way that was not like accusing them or telling them they're wrong or they're terrible. And so they did it in this kind, again, this sort of like relational way. And they got a lot of goodwill from that in doing it that way. And I'm also thinking of the Citizens Climate Lobby. They've actually done a lot of using Braver Angels training for having dialogues. And so they've really worked their skills of having conversations that don't believe about climate change or don't, and instead of going up against them as though these terrible people, you are fill in the blank negative words, they'll kind of they might even revisit their own position, or they might go, I didn't know that information. Or so it's dialogic and relational in nature. And I don't know how much, I don't have the results of their inroads. We kind of know where same-sex marriage went, but I think people like that maybe see a need for something to change, that are going about it that way. Versus some of these extreme, like we're going to throw paint on your whatever, or we're going to scream at you or punch you or mob you or something like that. Like that does not win anybody over, really. So I think there's a way to potentially do this, that maybe there's a humility, like maybe going into it with a certain humility. I'm going to learn. I'm not going to act like a jerk.
Well, that's right. Interesting, because it brings up the question of what activities comprise the concept of what are you doing if you're an activist? And if the definition the verb was campaigns, a person who campaigns for. So what is a campaign? Is it necessarily something that's super contentious, or could it be more like what you're talking about, just being dedicated to having dialogue that works towards opening people's mind on a particular issue? And in that case, I mean, that softens the concept of activism a little bit.
I was just thinking about Daryl Davis as you guys were talking as well. I'm thinking about his, conversion of God knows how many, I don't know how many Ku Klux Klan members it is now he's converted. But the fact that his model is very dialogical, isn't it? It's very much about understanding the human, going in with the questions of saying, you can't hate, well, how do you hate me if you don't know me? And then just starting from there, maybe even a Socratic entrance into this conversation, but one that's very human based. And would that not be activism? Because he's not chanting anything, he's not throwing things. I don't know. It's interesting.
It does seem like that would be, wouldn't it? It's a campaign, and he's trying to change something in a social milieu.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I wonder if he's got activism on his Twitter bio. He's not. Maybe he has humility, which I don't know which one of you said that, Leslie or Deborah, but Deborah. Humility. Yeah. Mm-hmm. How effective is your activism, and having conversations with people and on the opposite side of the corridor, it's like, yeah. What it wouldn't be lovely if our culture started to really celebrate that in more of a way.
Yeah, and genuine curiosity and humanity in the conversation. You guys want to check in on the chat? Thank you for joining us, everybody who's in the chat. Let's see. Oswald Spengler says techno-medievalism witch hunts. Techno-medievalism. That's an interesting idea. He's talking about your pitchfork and your torch, David. Yeah. Oceana 23 says Rufo knows that the language of activism can easily be flipped. And Friar Pessel says, hey y'all. Hello, Friar Pessel. Oceana 23 says Lindsay co-ops the Maoist vocabulary of anti-revolutionary. That's interesting.
Is it James Lindsay?
Mm-hmm, I think so. Mm-hmm. Yeah. And then Adam Radley says progress is defined by the proximity to an ideal. Therefore, everyone considers themselves progressive.
Right. That's interesting.
Yeah.
I mean, even Deborah, you even introduced yourself, I think, as someone who considered as
I had been. No, I don't know.
It's interesting. You were progressive. Now you're not so much. So maybe I don't know if there's anything you can talk to on that makes you feel like.
Oh, I don't want to monopolize the whole thing. I mean, this is something I've been thinking about deeply, but I feel a little like self-conscious. Let's just say, what I will say is I'm listening and taking in things from people who like Mary Harrington, who, what did she call herself, a feminist reactionary? I'm really contemplating a lot of things and question, what are my first principles, where, so I don't really know where I am exactly, but it's almost like I didn't even know, you're in a fishbowl and you don't know you're in it, and you kind of go out and you're like, oh, I only had this universe that was so big, and now I'm stepping back. I'm not sure where I land, but I'm not, there's a lot of things I'm wondering about. So that's where I'm at with it. I don't take as a given, if we do this solution, that's going to fix it. If we go this way, that's what we need to do. I don't know. I have many more questions about things that might have been done in the name of progressivism, that might have, the secondary effects or whatever, that might have been harmful. And it's still, in the end of the day, it might be on net. Maybe it's better. I don't know. This is where I don't know how to calculate what's good or bad, what's on net, how do we know, sort of thing. But I'm open to thinking that something that I thought really was good and a positive might not be.
Yeah. It sounds like it. I mean, this is something that I don't know how often you want to bring up Karl Marx in the spheres that we're in, because sometimes it can probably feel a little bit like, I'm not blooming Marxism again. But like the whole praxis idea of not you can't be content to understand the world, you have to change it. That feels like a very progressive, I don't know if you'd say progressive, but it's about change as opposed to understanding the world. And I've been just thinking, like, on my course, so many times when we get out of thinking about individualist sort of psychologist ideas or psychology ideas, we get into sort of, now we're going to embed culture into whatever frame we're talking about. It feels like we just handpick something from a Marxist lineage of ideas, and then we talk about culture in that way. And it's like, yeah, okay, well, we've now abdicated the old trying to understand the world bit. We've now pushed that to one side a little bit, haven't we? We've kind of gone, that big thing, society that's really complicated. Don't worry, we've got sort of a Marxist deflected lens to look at that. and we can talk about redistribution and these sorts of things. And now it becomes activist. And I feel that sometimes when I'm in the course, on the courses, there's a moment where we've talked about a specific service, a particular kind of psychological model, or even a type of mental health issue, and then we're trying to embed it in the cultural milieu of whatever you want to call it. Now we're going to think from a Marxist point of view, and it's like, and yeah, I just think we're off topic suddenly. We don't need to be on this viewpoint. Does that make sense? Kind of.
Yeah, no, it's interesting. It's this weird layer that's being added in where we have to consider that, and we're being asked to continually consider that. What I'm wondering is, it's so interesting how there's so many people who resonate with the kind of conversation that we keep having. This sort of segment of the population that's been politically disenfranchised, Sorry, I'm kind of taking it on a tangent off of what you said, David, but that just makes me think, like, how many people have had their minds shifted and, I don't know, do you want to call it opened? It sounds a little bit arrogant to say, but maybe not. I don't know.
I think there's also a lot of people that feel really politically homeless, because I meet all the time people who've always, grew up in families where they considered themselves to be very liberal, perhaps quite left-leaning, and they felt like the Democrats were really the party of the people, who cared about the working class and the middle class, who cared about the poor, who cared about women's issues. And a lot of people are now feeling like that's no longer the case, and that their party has become something that doesn't really embody their values, and that it's almost an entity that they don't recognize. And because of that, I think that people then shifted and started exposing themselves to maybe some more what we would have thought of, at least, I guess what we all thought of as more conservative ideas or more slightly right-wing ideas. And in a sense, that's been mind-opening for a lot of people. But I also think there's sort of a loss that people are feeling like they're displaced, and their party has become something that they don't know what the heck it is.
How much of this do you think as well is this conflation of the idea that this? I've heard so many people say this, that the Posey Parker or whatever was it New Zealand recently, like that she was branded like a Nazi and a fascist and stuff, but people defending very upset, angry LGBTQ activists, if you like, is to say, well, this is a bit like 10 years ago, someone coming out, fighting for gay rights, fighting for sexual rights. And it's like that conflation does so much work, I think, because it's not quite the same thing, is it? It's not the same thing. And yet this need for progress, this need to push things, is what certain parties like the Labour Party in England, the Democratic Party in the US have just gone, yeah, okay, so that's the next rung of the ladder. That's the next layer that we need to kick the door down for. That's the next set of oppressed individuals. And they've just kind of gone, that's it. And it's, for me, that's not enough. It's not enough to do that. And it's so easy to say, well, in the 1960s, if you're a black person, you'd be fighting for your rights. And it's like, no, they're not the same thing, I don't think. And that's the difference between the civil rights in the 1960s and today, I'd say.
Well, it's kind of the moral bankruptcy in the mercenary activism, right? Like, just, I'm an activist for the sake of activism. We're just going to keep on plowing forward, pushing the next. It's not about your value. It's about pushing down boundaries at that point. The way that you're describing it, that's what I'm kind of envisioning.
It's that liberation. It was not like Foucault was so big, but it's like this like as though the ultimate goal is some sort of ultimate liberation. And I have more of a, well, not just an Eastern spirituality orientation, but it's like, so much liberation in that system is that you don't let everything your mind says that you believe it. Like it's a very internal job how you get free. And we're in the activist, certain leftist view, not all, but it is this as though the world is just so oppressive, and we must be liberated from that instead of our own responses to, not that there isn't, you know, people were imprisoned and in chains, and like I think we would want to do something about that, like those are more obvious, but then when it gets in this subtler and subtler place where we're conceiving of people being enslaved or trapped or something, which is I think more of an inside, in some cases more of an inside job than some sort of external thing. And so they just, it seems like they keep looking for another external thing to consider the problem.
And Jay Bourne says in the chat, Jennifer echoed exactly what you were saying. I think you guys even said it at the same time. I saw it pop up. It says, I see more and more folks in these anti-woke and anti-mandate discussions claiming that they used to be progressive or politically homeless.
Yeah.
Yeah, sorry, I kind of threw that in right in the middle of the thought that you were going to respond to, Deborah.
Oh, I finished what I was saying. So
yeah, do you want to take it from there, David? Do you have any thought about what Deborah was saying? It kind of piggybacks off of yours.
No, I just enjoyed what you're saying, Deborah, about the sort of the fact that it's this need to liberate from the norms of society, and how postmodernism did quite a lot for, I don't know, thinking about mental disorders maybe as a spectrum rather than as categories, but it's just, yeah, it just feels like it's kind of cranked up to ridiculous levels at the moment. People are just trying to, activism for the sake of activism, and we're talking about progress, and I'm not sure we know what that progress actually means. It's very, very, very reductive at the moment.
Yeah, this does not feel at all to me like the sort of 1960s civil rights movement. I don't believe at all that what we are seeing now is a continuation of that. I think, they may have taken some elements and are using it that way and potentially disguising it that way, but I don't think that's what this is. I do see this as really an attempt at a cultural revolution, and really to tear down the existing system and to replace it with God knows what, because that's always poorly defined. Utopians always have a very difficult time explaining how things are going to work. But I really think we have sort of there's a sort of spirit of Maoism involved in the movements that we're seeing today, where it's not really the sort of very civilized powers of persuasion and dialogue that Deborah was talking about, but where it's an attempt to bully people and silence people and squash dissent, and if possible, ruin people's careers, and strip them of their livelihood simply for disagreeing, even though most people are, saying, hey, you do you, that's fine. Here's how I think about this topic. Here's how I think about sex or gender, but that's not okay. It's like people wanting to control the very thoughts in other people's heads. And also there's this, I think, aided in part by technology and social media. There's sort of the corporate and governmental participation in this, where corporations are all, basically they're figuring out how they can make money off of it, but they're also playing a role in this that I don't know was present during the civil rights movement. And there's also what you were saying earlier, Deborah, about the sort of a different view of liberation. And, I've read a very small amount, but I've read a little bit of queer theory, and they were talking about how reality and the present are prisons, and that we have to smash through these things. So there's this sort of destructive, narcissistic impulse that has overcome the West, I think, in certain groups, where boundaries in and of themselves are regarded as a negative and something to be torn down, including very basic sexual boundaries, the boundaries of age of consent. There's people who've embraced queer theory that are also really pushing this, and this immense interest in children's sexuality and making sure that they meet drag queens and telling them when they're in kindergarten that only they know what their gender is, and they can select it and then let the adults know, so children are going to dictate to adults now, which is the tearing down of another boundary. I don't really know what to say about it other than it's completely unsettling. And I don't know that if we follow that trajectory, I don't think it leads anywhere good. And I think that the civil rights movement did lead somewhere very, very good. And this I see as sort of the road to hell, so to speak. There's my cheerful thoughts for the day.
I was
That's
talking-
a tough one. Oh, go ahead, David.
No, go on, Deborah.
No, someone was been tweeting. I've seen people tweeting about this. I mean, it's so tricky because I would say I would want the civil rights movement. I'd want what happened there, and then, but someone was saying once you have these protected classes, and we even wanted women as protected class in some sense, but then it does have this setup for starting to have other things get protected that we might not. And I don't know whether it's just those things sometimes you have that are a mixed bag, or should you have never done them? I sit with that one because I can't imagine going back to 1964 and saying we shouldn't have done some of the things we did there in terms of at least those immediate bunches, decade or two or three, after seemed good. I don't know if there's something wrong in the design of it. I haven't thought about it enough yet, but I do have that concern when people saying we should never have had the protected classes. And I'm like, oh, I don't know. How do I think about that? I don't know if you guys have thought about it.
That's similar.
Thinking about it potentially is rather than framing it as protected classes, frame it as every group is protected from discrimination.
Mm-hmm.
That's how I think is the most fair way of exercising those principles. Because there's been some questions as to, well, can white people be discriminated against? And some people say no, because they're not a protected class. Which then, if you don't have the protection, you very quickly end up being an exploited class. So those principles of, not discriminating against people based on immutable characteristics, I think have to be extended to everybody.
But then by that logic, can you create new groups and then create new forms of discrimination that you accuse people of? Sort of like with one thing I keep seeing with like the trans activists is this idea that people are erasing trans people and that trans people don't have basic human rights and that their existence is being denied. And so that's a framing of it in those exact terms, that they're framing it like we are a group that's being discriminated against. And here's how. So
it makes me think that I was thinking as you were saying protected classes a little bit, I was thinking, so protected from what? And like, do we mean protected? Because I guess what you're saying is what we have groups of people that we just want to wrap up in cotton wool and protect them. Because Camille Paglia was talking about women's rights from 34 years ago. And she's made quite a bold statement. She sort of says, I wanted to fight for the rights for women to go out, live their lives and risk getting raped. She said, because she said that what we were having before was the idea that we were such fragile creatures that we would be set upon by any person who might want to at any point. So we were like, not allowed out of the house after a certain time, or not considered to have, need to be weak. We were considered to be sort of vulnerable all the time. But she was obviously fighting to say we don't have to be seen as vulnerable. We don't have to be seen in that way, and therefore we can grow, we can build, and we can become something more. And it just makes me think, yeah, are we doing that with these protected classes? I don't know.
And that's tricky on the women one, right? Because on the other hand, we might say we do want, some women might want like same-sex spaces.
Yeah.
On sex, right? And they want that because they're women, they want their protection, right? So that's a double-edged one, I think. I get you're saying like she doesn't want to infantilize anybody, right? If we're sort of saying men and women are equal, and then we're going, oh, but we're going to treat you still like a child or something, that's not really getting you there.
No. And And I mean, also, when people say that, like you said, Leslie, people are being erased, you kind of go, in what way are people being erased? Like, you know, and that was how the Posey Parker thing was framed, was that she was erasing trans people. I saw it on the news in New Zealand, I think, the local news. I was interested in seeing how they reported it, and they were saying that she's actually trying to erase people, and it's like, no, she really is just talking about women's spaces, and she is talking about the definition of women, but somehow it's erasing someone else in the process. Yeah.
Yeah, it's interesting. It also, you know, in all this, I think about the more people who've been more on the conservative side for a long time will raise the slippery slope idea with a lot of these movements, like the marriage equality movement, for instance. People will say, well, we could have seen this coming. Once you allow gay marriage, then you've opened the door to, and they'll name a whole bunch of other cultural sexual boundaries. There's, well, now we're going to have bestiality, now we're going to have pedophilia, now, you know, and so you've got all these I told you so's now from the group that saw that as a natural progression of boundary destruction, versus what you're saying, Jennifer and Deborah, about how it does seem like there's some, like you can conceive of a moral pin that could be dropped at a certain point and say, okay, well, these things were valuable and have been a societal good, but that's where we should have stopped. We could have stopped here. And so how do we determine that? How does a culture determine where that pin can be dropped? How much is too much? How much freedom is good for people to enjoy, and how much constraint do we need socially?
I think that's the tension, right? I mean, and Jordan Peterson would probably frame it as the tension between order and chaos. And he says you very much need both. And I think that's true. And you need different groups pushing for that, hopefully pushing through conversation and dialogue and persuasion. But I do actually believe in slippery slope arguments. I actually do believe them. And I used to scoff at them, and I thought conservative Christians were out of their minds, and I thought they were bigots. And I feel extremely humbled by it, because I think that in many ways they have largely been proven right. I think the floodgates have opened, and I think we're having a lot of negative repercussions to some of the changes that we've made that I'm not necessarily blaming those changes, but I'm saying there doesn't seem to be an end point at which people say, hey, we more or less have a reasonable society. It could use a little tweaking here and there, but things are more or less reasonable. And I mean, in terms of what you were saying earlier too, Leslie, about like the, protected classes and immutable characteristics, when I say immutable characteristics, I'm thinking of race, and I'm thinking of sex, and sex being male and female. I don't perceive trans to be an immutable characteristic. I consider it, I mean, it's obviously highly malleable if you're having hormones and surgeries to change your appearance to match a subjective sense that you have. So I don't see that as something immutable, nor do I see it immutable that, some people consider themselves to be otherkins, meaning sort of non-human, or that they identify as a furry. And that's fine, because I don't care what thoughts are in other people's heads. People may certainly do as they like, but I don't think those things are immutable characteristics.
And it seems like I don't
think you can compare being, identifying yourself as trans to something like the racial background that you're born into. I don't view those as analogous.
And that argument seems like that's what's being debated by some of the activists on that side. That is the kind of the crux of the conflict, where they'll say, no, there is such a thing as and this is like opening up a can, because we're right here, like at the end of our live stream, talking about this issue, which could go on for hours, but they'll say, no, they'll use the born this way kind of concept. No, I am. And there've been trans people all throughout history. They just didn't have access to the right kind of care to give them the gender affirmation that they needed. And, it just seems like that once, if you open up the possibility for like protected groups and what is an immutable characteristic, you're going to have people who want to play with that language. And it just seems like it's a malleable concept in some people's minds.
Interesting.
It's kind of, if you're anchoring on identity and like subjectivity. I guess you're saying there's an argument it's not subjective, it's objective or something, like someone might claim that identity. But once we start having identities versus like, I don't know, this is this is who I am. That's a slippery slope. I mean,
yeah. What do you think, David?
Yeah, I agree. Yeah. Yeah, I'm not sure. I'm not always sure where to go because I'm sure we could open this up quite a bit.
I know. It's a big meaty one.
I thought I'll go back to one of the, just on the activist thing a little bit, which it's a little bit going off where we are right now, but it was one of the things I said before we got on the live stream, which was, and maybe we define all activists as not having this interior state. I don't know, but I was revisiting a quote by somebody, what's his name? Bill O'Brien. He used to be like a CEO of an insurance company, but he said something about the success of an intervention depends on the interior condition of the intervener. And like, so often, at least we see our conception of activists are people who are largely in kind of a us them thinking, fighting the big bad, whatever. So there may be some reality to what's happening, but it seems to me there's often a lot of projection, like psychologically. And so the person isn't coming from kind of a centered state. And therefore what they're trying to do is probably not taking into consideration, the entire environment, the complex system. And that's just likely whatever they're doing to set off reactions on the other side and just, or potentially have a solution that actually is worse than the problem, or something like that. And so I don't know if we see a lot of people taking action who aren't engaged in that. I don't want to say there aren't any, because I want to have the possibility that there are, and I'm not aware of them. They certainly aren't getting on social media and being, they're not getting a lot of attention. They're quietly doing their thing.
No, that's a really good point. I like that framework. It reminds me of, I think David said it earlier about Jordan Peterson's clean your room thing. It sounds like that, like kind of get your own head right, get your thinking right before you go trying to make changes in other things. It's similar concept, but and pointing out that people in some of the movements we're seeing right now are really engaging in a lot of splitting, a lot of projection, a lot of really pretty dysfunctional thinking. Yeah.
And to some people, activism is, I'm upset and I'm going to scream out loud and throw something at something. It's infantile in some ways, isn't it? But it's a kind of case of the culture feels like it's encouraging people to do that, and it's certainly doing that on the course that I'm on. And the course staff don't know what to do about it. It feels like they've set the scene for this to allow people to just lean into their sort of emotional reactions and not in any way sort of encourage those people. And I'm not saying it would be an easy thing to do. My heart goes out to some of them in some ways to try and help steer some of these individuals we've got a few unprocessed things potentially to consider whether or not they have some responsibility, some level in which they are creating the very conditions that they seem to be railing against. And it's I think Deborah mentioned it earlier, it feels like an unintegrated shadow type thing that's going on the course. Yeah.
Concern me too, like seeing not all of them, but some of the SEL curricula kind of come across my eyeballs. And I can't say it's again all of it, but I've seen some of it where it's actually trying to get children upset, like telling them about an injustice, showing them a very sad story about some sort of oppressed group or whatever, and then actually wanting the children to like write and like almost get like, how sad are you? How angry are you about this? And like to actually try to like harness children's upset, like on purpose to get them to be activists. And I just feel like that just feels really abusive.
And that's the gaslighting part of it, isn't it? Of kind of going, and this work is going to be hard. It's going to be troublesome, and it's almost like the emotion validates the process. The I don't know, but it seems so backward, and it feels, again, sorry to come back to my course, but it seems so backward for us as psychologists or trainee psychologists to be doing that to each other. And I just know that even I've had personally some teachers or facilitators of groups and things say to me that this is going to be troublesome and it is going to be hard, and you have to get comfortable with these feelings. And I'm just thinking that just feels very, gaslighty, to be honest.
Well, yeah, it's a deliberate cultivation of a sense of moral superiority and moral outrage. And if you disagree with it, they've got that written right in. That's the answer as well. You sit with your difficult feelings. Mm-hmm. And so there's no way to argue intellectually against it because they already have their response packaged for you. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, I guess we're at the end of our hour. That's abrupt. Yeah, have a great day.
Keep up the good fight.
Yeah. Yeah. Deborah, thank you very much for joining us today. I hope you can join us again in the future. That'd be really fun to have you again.
Thank you.
And thanks for a great conversation. Does anybody have any final thoughts? Does anybody have a beautiful way to wrap this up in a bow so we can go have a good day?
They're coming after our kids. Sorry.
Jennifer's good for this. Jennifer's got us. Come on, Jennifer.
I have nothing to say for myself. Every time I'm on one of these live streams, I worry, like, is this the live stream where people are going to show up at my house afterwards with pitchforks?
Oh, Jay in the chat, Jay says kittens. Yes. Kittens.
Yes.
Oh, kittens.
Kittens, yeah. Yes. No. That's a good one. All right.
Wait. I like the idea, Leslie, that you introduced slightly earlier. You hinted at the idea that perhaps we could consider ourselves activists. And I think what we've learned a little bit is that the definition of activism, or even the definition of progress, is still ongoing, and certainly we can potentially label ourselves and redefine that. I'm not going to put it in my Twitter bio because I'm not on Twitter, but if people would like to come join the activist movement, come to Solid Ground.
Be an active activist.
That's it. Like and subscribe, guys.
And be an activist by having conversations.
Yeah.
With nuance.
That's progressive.
Yeah. Awesome.
I think Aisha Kambi said something like in this day and age, to be tolerant of other people's opinions is to be radical. To be radical. Oh, I'm messing it up now, but she said something like that. Go check it out.
I like it. I'm all about the radical centrism. So works good. Yeah. Awesome. Well, lovely to talk with you all today.
Thank you.
Okay.
Cheers.
Bye-bye.
Bye.